Good morning. Welcome to the fourth day of Environmental Action Civics. I feel like I've been sitting in this seat for 4 days solid, so hopefully it has been exciting and fun for everybody. Yesterday, another great day. We had, I think, for Instagram Live, we had a 19-year-old author of a great book about youth engagement, and in the evening, we had a panel of middle school kids who had all taken on environmental projects in their area, and so really a great and exciting day. And today kicks off with a conversation that I've been looking forward to quite a bit. I was just telling Dr. Kirshner that, of course, we're pretty much a bunch of nerds, and so we've been reading his research in the background, and so I'm having a little bit of a fanboy moment going on. But let me introduce you to Dr. Ben Kirshner from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And Dr. Kirshner, in addition to being a faculty member, runs a program called Transformative Student Voice, which is very action civics influenced, and has done some interesting pilot work that we're going to talk about with Denver Public Schools. So welcome, Dr. Kirshner.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be here. Thanks, Vince.
Yeah, thank you. That's, as I said, we are a little bit nerds and been reading your research, and I want to talk to you that I've been reading it, and I read it again last night quite a bit. Your research around scaling this kind of work, and you've written. I think it's relatively recently, a piece on scaling a project called Creative Civic Inquiry. Am I getting that right?
Critical civic inquiry. Yep.
Critical Civic Inquiry. I apologize. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and the partnership with Denver Public Schools?
Yeah, for sure. It's been a wonderful project. Our partner in Denver Public Schools at the time was Solicia Lopez. She's really founded she founded and kind of created a beautiful organization called Student Voice and Leadership that used a combination of kind of youth community organizing and student voice to build something within the school district that I think is really rare and continues to be a really strong program. She's no longer the director. But we have been working together really since 2017 to figure out different ways that researchers and educators and students can work together to build something strong. I really want to mention my colleagues because it's been a collaborative effort with Carlos Hipólito Delgado, who's at UC Denver, and then Shelley Zion at Rowan University, as well as a lot of other team members who write curriculum and spend time in classrooms and work with students, et cetera. But the general idea was to find ways for research to support implementation, and that's what a research practice partnership is. And so we tried to go with where the questions were, whether those were questions that teachers might have had or that the program leadership had, or tasks that they were facing, to kind of make a case to the district about their value as a program.
So that's part of what I wanted to talk to you about. So some of the writing that you've done talks about the attempts to take this from essentially a pilot program where there were some really bought in educators, that were really committed to it and stuff, and then to grow that out into kind of the second level. And in that process, you ran into some barriers. And I think I think I told you this in an email, but I think this is synonymous in many ways to what environmental education is facing as they try to move from, we used to call it the teacher in the trailer, that teacher that's really cool that they put outside in the trailer,
Right.
does neat stuff. From that teacher to kind of a broader group of educators, particularly when they're trying to incorporate things like historical racism, they've run into barriers. So I'd love to have you talk to us about the barriers that you've run into in kind of growing that out and scaling that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me tell the story, and it's I'll be concise, but also give it some of the complexity. So there was a call for grant proposals, which sometimes can dictate some of the kinds of work we want to do because there's resources attached. And so the Hewlett Foundation was really interested in understanding how to scale what they call deeper learning, which is essentially very aligned, I would say, with an Action Civics agenda, because it's inquiry-based and really engaging students in problem solving and working together on academic tasks that matter to them. And so I want to start by saying, DPS was totally on board, and folks in the office that we partnered with, really wanted to make this happen and support their expansion. They were already in, I think, about roughly 18 to 20 high schools, but the agenda of this project was over 3 years to really try to build it out to do exactly what you said, Vince, which is try to move it from being the kind of exceptional or rare teacher who might be like working a little bit against the grain against the grain or in isolation, and create a more supportive kind of ecosystem for the work they want to do. And the beauty of this particular project was that we were also encouraged to study it and study it together, like with the district and ourselves, to really understand. And one of the first things you'll notice, and we wrote about it in the article, but for anyone who's listening, if you're thinking about how you do that move from the isolated educator to the working kind of in numbers, power in numbers, kind of collaborative work, is that the literature on those efforts, the research literature suggests it can be very challenging to change any system or to make change, in a big institution. So it's just important to recognize that regardless of where you are, regardless of the good intentions of the different human beings who are working in these systems and the really talented nature of their work, it can be hard to make those changes. But so I'll just say a couple things about the strategy that we developed kind of together. One was very organic to the district and to the Student Voice and Leadership program, which was to say, and this is maybe different than some of the scaling literature, it very much ought to be bottom up. And by bottom up, I just mean the most effective ambassadors for building this program and strengthening our students. I will say, again, for listeners who design these kinds of programs and who work in them, one of the qualities that I think helped enable students to be effective agents for scaling this kind of approach and creating more support for it is that students are allowed to experience it more than 1 year. So I don't know what all the kinds of experiences in different kind of environmental action programs have, but students would often start as sophomores, and then they could kind of continue to be part of this experience in junior and senior year, and often would experience a kind of leadership ladder, moving up and taking on more responsibility. But what that meant is they were around for long enough to not just develop some skills and attachments to the vision, but also kind of develop relationships with key adults with whom they could advocate for different kinds of changes. So I do want to say that if you're thinking about, one of the things that we thought a lot about when we were trying to scale the model was, what's our theory of change? And then when you ask that question, it doesn't need to be fancy. I think anybody can ask that question of themselves, like, yeah, what do we think we need to do in order to get to where we want to go? And what are some of the assumptions we should also be acting based on? So I'll elaborate on that in a second. But I just want to say one of the key assumptions we had was that students are going to be key ambassadors for this work. And then another was to develop relationships with different kinds of adult leadership, principals, people in the district level, who could be facilitators to kind of help it happen by aligning it more with existing incentives at the district and school level. So I hope that wasn't too wonky, but that was at least a start. I'm happy to elaborate on different pieces.
Not wonky at all. One of the things that I thought was a really interesting explanation, really useful for me to understand the work you're talking about, is the interdependence between vertical and horizontal scaling, right?
Great.
And how those two work together. Could you just explain that concept a little bit, and then we'll chat about it some?
Yeah. So I want to give my credit here to Shelley Zion, who's really been working on this idea and actually wrote that portion of the paper, but I can explain it. I'm pretty sure I can do it justice. So vertical is just meant to signal kind of movement up an institutional hierarchy. So let's pay attention to kind of the kinds of pressures and pressures and incentives that school leadership work in, like principals, and then also district coordinators who are in charge of curriculum and instruction, people who do assessment for the district, people who do school improvement planning. So both that would be school leadership, but also at the district level, coaches who support school improvement planning. What are the metrics they use? What kinds of data do they use? But also what's the ecosystem of kind of incentives and also penalties that they're working in? And are there ways to align that? That's the vertical side of things. Just one example, most school districts will have some kind of system for school improvement planning or a unified improvement plan. And so how might engaging students as partners in this work or creating opportunities for student leadership and voice be part of improvement planning was one kind of strategy that I think got some purchase. So that's an example of vertical. And then I think the idea there of horizontal is that you're trying to also, this might look different depending on the size of your school district, but certainly in a school district where there's many schools and not just say one high school or one middle school. So in larger school districts, the idea would be to try to ensure that there was implementation across schools, and that's the horizontal side. And then more specifically, not just across schools, but across teachers. So I'll just say one point about that and then turn it back to you. We started off, and you used the image of the teachers kind of teaching outside in the trailer. Certainly, we had experience of partnering with really exceptional teachers who also had supportive principals, but who kind of felt isolated in their buildings. This was before this project with TPS, and so how can you create a kind of a cohort of teachers who are supporting each other, exchanging ideas, um, standing up for each other as well? So that's kind of what the horizontal piece is power in numbers across teachers, across students, and across schools.
I want to just reference a little bit. A few years ago at Earthforce, we had a grant partnership with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, to look at their BWET program. It's the Bay Watershed Education Training Program, and it wants teachers to implement. There's a lot of acronyms here because it's the government. Wants teachers to implement something called MWEs, Meaningful Watershed Education Experiences. And an essential part of that meaningful watershed education experience is that kids, after studying environmental issues, then take action to try and address, in some way. And there's a number of different ways. Some are civic, some are more conservation oriented, yada, yada, yada. But the challenge was that there seemed to always be a group of people who, regardless of the incentive system, would never quite get to the action portion. Right. And so we were asking, why was that? Right. Why didn't they, why did they do the rest of the MWE and then have a challenge to get to that action portion? And I'm not saying it's the majority or anything, but there was a group in there that was a challenge. And so we did some surveys and some interviews and so on and so forth. And what we found is something we called the orientation challenge, right? Which was essentially that if you were an educator, whether informal or formal, and you looked at environmental education and believed that students taking action was an essential piece of the learning, of that deeper learning experience, then you were able to overcome all the different kind of barriers to it. If you were an educator that looked at that but didn't think that action was essential or important to the deeper learning experience, all the barriers that kind of accumulated, time, money, resources, et cetera, just kept you from ever overcoming it, right? You just couldn't get past there. Have you guys seen, as you've done some scaling, do you see some similar, kind of impacts or effects among educators, the type of work that you're doing? I mean, the work you're doing is large, we should say, and I don't know if we have said this, it's largely based around racial disparities, racial equality, from the student's perspective, not from your own perspective, obviously.
Yeah, so I would say to kind of clarify, so I work as part of a team. I'm at the University of Colorado, as I mentioned. I'm part of a team of folks at a few different universities, and we call ourselves now Transformative Student Voice. And I mention that just because we have a website and there's some links to resources there, and we do projects in different parts of the country. And we also develop curriculum. Now, with regard to like the focal topics that students focus on, it's very actually dictated by the kinds of organizations and programs we partner with. It's true that the curriculum that we've developed is meant to encourage teachers to invite what we call critical conversations, which is to say conversations about topics that are honest and open and vulnerable, that in some schools may be part of business as usual, but in many schools aren't, and particularly now, given some of the bans on different kinds of conversations about racial justice. Okay, so thanks. I just wanted to clarify that. In the work with DPS, there are all kinds of issues students work on. Often they were around racial justice issues like disparities in access to or kind of experiences of curriculum. Another one would be around, concerns about the role of police in schools and challenging the school to prison pipeline. So that's often the kind of work, but sometimes it takes on issues of kind of around fundamental dignity, like, oh, our school took off the doors on our bathrooms, kind of thing, because of concerns that students were vaping, and we're really upset about that. I'm not talking about Denver now, I'm just talking about kind of across the country when we work with people. So it can vary quite a bit in terms of the issues. To your question, which was about kind of this issue of orientation, as I understand it, and this issue of action. And what I hear you saying is there was a desire and a kind of expectation to engage students in some kind of action or activism about the work they did around watersheds, if I understood you right. And there was a lot of variability in terms of who did it, who didn't, or which classes did it and which didn't. And you
Which
found,
teachers
go ahead.
more about which teachers thought it was important or
Okay.
valuable and which teachers
Yeah.
didn't, or which adults, better way to say it, than
Yeah.
teachers.
Yeah. Well, I guess so. I want to speak to it in a couple ways. I've had the pleasure, for the most part, I'd say, of working in spaces where there's some level of self-selection into being what they're called coaches in student voice and leadership, but regardless, educator, teacher. So they tend to be interested in supporting students in that way. But let me say a couple of things. One thing that student voice and leadership does, which might address a little bit of what you're describing. I don't know enough about the model to say, but in addition to wanting and encouraging and expecting, at each school that students would be reaching out and doing different kinds of actions with their school leadership, depending on what the topic was. They also organize a summit, that the district organizes, that they invite the district leadership to, and that most senior district leadership attend. And I guess I'm just sharing that because it's interesting to me. So it doesn't put the whole burden on the team or the teacher, right? There's a kind of an event that's organized where students are kind of speaking truth to decision makers about the issues they care about. It's not easy to put on; it's a lot of work. But that youth summit is something that we've seen, which has helped address that issue. I also do want to say something that I've noticed. So it may or may not resonate. Um, what I've noticed as one of the factors that can undermine the action piece of action civics or make it more performative than substantive is the kind of institutional logic of school. And I don't mean, again, I'm not talking about any local district or specific school. I'm just talking about American schools in general, which is, that students are learners in those spaces, we hope. And so sometimes I have found that action is interpreted as a cool learning experience for students, which it is. But the piece that makes it a special learning experience is actually that it's meaningful and real, right? You're actually speaking to a decision maker. You're interacting in some way with people who might be able to help you change a policy. And what I found sometimes is that the institutional logic of American public schools will treat it more like, oh, this is an event that maybe needs to be graded or is part of a curriculum, but it's a performance. It's not or it's a certain kind of performance, but it's not doing something real and risky. And sometimes that that riskiness of it is a challenge, and I think that's real. Like teachers face a lot of burdens in their work. God, so many. And so that risk is something that we try to talk about collectively and think about. I'm happy to say more about that if you want.
Yeah, well, actually, the one thing I'd love to hear your opinion on is we try to get kids to do stuff that is real and risky as well, young people.
Hmm.
We think there's inherent value in the risk, right? And the
Hmm.
young people
Hmm.
putting themselves out there in a way that is risky,
Hmm.
right? Um, do you think there's value in that? I mean, I don't know
Oh,
that it's quantifiable, but
right. So absolutely. It's really interesting. This is a topic that I'll probably talk for too long about, but let me say a couple of things about it. Um, so, so I'll say three things, and I'll try to be organized because I really love this topic. So first, I've also done a lot of research outside of school, and I was able to do a study of youth activism and organizing in 7 countries. This is a few years back with a scholar named Rod Watts, and these were out of school community organizing groups. We got to do a lot of interviews with young people about their experiences, and the most salient experience that they talked about, not the only one, but the kind of, to my takeaway about the most powerful experience was that experience of taking that risk to put yourself out there in the public sphere, speak truth to power, engage with people who have some kind of positional authority. And it's often scary and you feel anxious going into it, and you might actually not succeed. But that was where there was so much learning. Now it was in an ecosystem that supported that learning, right? So these were groups that offered debriefs afterward. Let's talk about what happened, and there's a lot of coaching and preparation going into it. But that risk is, I think, a key part to, like, wow, we're actually doing something different here. and I'm a little nervous, and that's a space of learning and growth. So that's point number one. Point number two is that second one around what's the supportive conditions that can help this kind of risk be a opportunity for learning as opposed to just I felt exposed. um, I want to give a shout out to a graduate researcher here named Beatriz Salazar, who writes a lot about failure and the opportunities to learn through failure and setback, and has really reframed for me that sometimes these action projects don't succeed. Like they might get shut down by the leadership that they're talking to, or they might kind of get a pat on the back, but nothing really happens. But those are spaces where a lot of learning happens too. And I will say that to the folks who are paying attention to our conversation, particularly educators, I've definitely encountered people being nervous, educators, that is, teachers, adults, who don't want to necessarily put students in situations where they might fail. So, for example, they might discourage them from being too ambitious with their social change goals, or they might try to kind of discourage them from doing things that they think are sure to not succeed. And I guess the data that, or my values and the experience I've had doing research about this is that that's not something we should or can protect students from or young people from. We can provide a context where we can try to do our best to help ensure it's a learning opportunity. We can also maybe share like, hey, here's some of the consequences you might expect from this. Let's talk about it. Do you feel ready for it? So that's point number two. Last one, and then I'll wrap up. There is a risk, and people write about this, that I want to say I don't approve of, which is, I guess some people might call it like trauma gazing, or that maybe is not the phrase, but essentially where students are encouraged to tell stories of trauma or pain narratives that can move an audience, but actually don't feel very good for the student. So that's one area where I do not approve of putting students in risky situations. I think that happens sometimes, and I try to be really mindful of it. Both not wanting to have students feel like they need to put themselves on display in order to make a change happen, and also be aware of some consequences that can be very real. This was true, say, for young activists around undocumented rights issues around immigration, having to be really thoughtful about what kind of risk students could take. So sometimes the stakes are really high.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's kind of a complex
But
statement.
the risk can also, I mean, it doesn't have to
Be
be,
thoughtful about it. Go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, I don't think it has to be life-threatening risk.
Right.
You know, like
Right.
like we had a
Right.
I was actually one of the young girls that was on a presentation last night was talking about how they had a piece of legislation that they wanted the mayor to put in their legislative package to go
Mm-hmm.
to the state legislature, and they hadn't been able to get the attention of the mayor, and so they showed up some community event. We're getting signatures, you know, have the mayor do this, you know,
Mm-hmm.
tell the mayor you want this piece of legislation, and this man walked up to her and he was like, "Tell me why you want it in the legislation," blah blah blah, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and and he said, "Well, do you know who I am?" And she was like, "No." And he said, "I'm the mayor." And so
Yeah.
she was like, "I was so scared. It was so, you know, outside my comfort zone." And, you know,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a great learning experience for her. And so
Yeah.
it was, you know, it taught her that she could actually talk to the mayor, you
Yeah.
know,
That's great.
which,
Yeah.
you know,
I
and
agree with you. Yeah.
so
And
not as high of a risk as that, but, you know, but still it put her in a situation she was uncomfortable with.
right. Right. I like it. Yeah. That's a good example. And I think that discomfort is, as you know, as like we all know, that is kind of a space where we can learn. And again, I think the key is like, let's think of that itself as a kind of curriculum or as a kind of learning experience, right? So how do we think about ahead of it? How do we kind of practice? And then how do we get a chance to talk about it after and identify kind of what we're learning from it? And
That's great.
so those are pieces that kind of can surround those challenging and risky encounters that help turn them into developmental opportunities.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Kirshner, this has been great. I have like 10 more questions that I'm
Yeah.
going to cut myself off. But
Okay.
this is a fantastic and deep conversation. I appreciate your perspectives on all of this and being willing to come on and talk to us about a little bit different approach to kind of the integration or systemizing this work and some of the interesting things for young people. And so that has been really great. And so those folks out there that are interested, we put the website link in the Instagram chat, and it's also in the StreamYard chat, and probably by now in the LinkedIn chat. So if anywhere you want to find it, it's there, and you can go ahead and take a look. And this is Dr. Ben Kirshner. And Dr. Kirshner, any last words of wisdom from
Yeah.
Colorado today?
Well, I really want to shout out and celebrate the work of the Student Voice and Leadership Program in Denver Public Schools because they're doing really amazing work. They continue to do strong work led by Magnolia Landa Posas, and it's with support of the district. And so, yes, there are barriers, there's challenges when we're trying to build this work. But what's exciting to me is like there's a lot of people trying to move in the same direction, and that's like the power of that partnership. So I really just want to thank them for the partnership and the work, and then generally thank you for having me on. And I invite anybody who checks out our website or follows us, please reach out. We'd love to talk and be in conversation.
Great. Thank you. And with
Thank
that,
you
we're
very
going to
much.
say good morning, good afternoon, still morning, I think. Everywhere that,
Good.
well, everywhere that I am anyway. Good morning. Thanks, Dr. Kirshner.
All
Talk to
right.
you
Thank
later.
you. Take care.
All right. Bye
Bye.
bye.